guys, so look where I am. I am back in Edinburgh at the moment. I'm visiting for my mum's birthday, but I had some time, so I thought as it's the 1st of April when I'm filming this and March has just ended, it would be the perfect time to film my March reading wrap up from the comfort of my study. I recently posted a bookshelves tour of this room with all of my books I don't have in London with me, so if you haven't seen that I'll link that down below. But it's always so nice being back here and it feels so relaxing, so I'm looking forward to talking to you about some books whilst I'm here. So let's start at the very beginning. The first book I finished in the month of March was Furies, a poetry anthology of women warriors, and guys, this was phenomenal. I have never enjoyed a poetry anthology as much as I enjoyed this one. What makes a poetry anthology unique from a poetry collection is that it is all different poets. So it is a collection of poems written by different poets, which by its very nature means there's a good chance that there will be poets you dislike. If you're reading an individual poets collection, I find you either love it, hate it, or somewhere in between, whereas a poetry anthology can take you throughout the spectrum of emotions and feelings towards different poets because it's such a variety. However, I was so impressed that I enjoyed 99% of the poems in this collection and loved, more than 50%. I thought this collection was fantastic, and there are a few poets in here in particular who I do intend on seeking out more poetry by, whether they've written full collections or just have works in other anthologies. I don't have my copy here with me because it is in London, so I can't go through the specific poets that I enjoyed the most right here and now, but if you'd like to see a separate video on the anthology, I'd be happy to do that when I'm back with my copy. However, I would say if you are tentative about poetry, are looking for new poets are looking to discover new poets and just expand your world of poetry, this would be a wonderful collection to check out. But not only that, but the profits are actually donated to charity. But the next book I finished in the month of March was a novel, and it was The Children of Jocasta by Natalie Haynes. It feels like I read this book years ago now. Do you ever feel like that? Really, I only finished it about three and a half weeks ago, but it feels like it was a long time ago. Maybe that's just because I started reading it in February. But I really enjoyed this book. This book is a retelling of the Greek myth of Oedipus, or Jocasta, who was Oedipus's mother and wife. That relationship, however, between Jocasta and Oedipus, whether they were actually related, is not so clear-cut or obvious in this novel. And what I really enjoyed about this Greek myth retelling was, first of all, that it is set in antiquity. It is not a myth reapplied to a modern situation. It is set in antiquity, in the time this myth was set originally, but it almost extracts the mythological elements of the story. It makes all of the things in the myth that were to do with gods or mythical creatures explainable according to real phenomenons, replacing beasts with humans, curses with diseases, and I really enjoyed that. I thought it made these characters feel so real and bring them to life in a really new way for me, having only experienced them in a few ancient Greek plays in the past. It's told from the perspectives of both Jocasta, from her teenage years to her first marriage, through her meeting of Oedipus, and essentially her life until the culmination of the myth. I won't tell you what happens in case you're not familiar and don't want spoilers. And the other half of the chapters, these flip between the two different narrators, are told from the perspective of Jocasta and Oedipus's youngest daughter, who isn't as heavily featured in the original myths as her sister Antigone. You certainly don't need to be familiar with the myth to read this story. It is a full story in itself. Natalie Haynes doesn't assume you know this story and therefore need to know it to understand the plot, but of course if you are familiar with the myth and have read some of the ancient material, it's quite a nice comparison, but you could definitely do that in the reverse order. The only thing I would have liked perhaps was a little bit of expansion on some of the points. There was a character at the beginning that goes away somewhere, we don't know where, he disappears, he could have died. really no information on that, and I would have loved to know what happened there, and I would have also liked greater time to be spent on the initial development of Oedipus and Jocasta's relationship, but at the same time there was a lot packed into this book, and I think the author did a phenomenal job, and I would still highly recommend it. I then read the first volume of the comic book series Paper Girls. This is published by Image Comics, who are one of my favourite comic book publishers, and I've been meaning to pick up this series for the longest time as I've heard nothing but good things about it, and it matched all of my expectations. 5 out of 5 stars, one of the best comic books I've read in a while. This book is set, I believe, in the 1980s, and it's often compared to Stranger Things, which I would completely agree with in its tone. It follows a group of 4 paper delivery girls. When something weird starts to happen, it very quickly turns into a science fiction graphic novel in this 1980s setting with these really precocious 12-year-old girls who I want to describe as having gumption, but I realise that makes me sound like an 80-year-old person. But yeah, that's the kind of sense that they have. They are very independent and really good fun, and there's a definite sense of humour running throughout this comic book. And yeah, I absolutely adored it, and there was a real cliffhanger there right at the end. So I've ordered the second volume and will be reading it as soon as I get back to London. I then read a book which I've done an entire review of, so I will link that down below if you're interested, but that is Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, and I was so apprehensive going into this book given the hype surrounding it, but I ended up adoring it, and that is after finding the first 50 pages quite difficult to get into. So I read the first 50 pages in the book and then decided, do you know what, I'm liking this but I'm not compelled by it, so I'm going to swap to audiobook because I've heard a lot of really good reviews of the audiobook, and after I did that I couldn't put it down, and the more I got into it the more I was hooked, and by the end I was kind of devastated it was over, although I think the ending was pretty perfect. This is a dystopian novel that focuses in on 3 main characters, one of whom is our narrator, and they grow up together in this strange boarding school that raises children who seemingly have no parents for a greater purpose in the world that they live in. That purpose is not made clear from the outset of the novel, but is gradually unveiled to us until sort of the midpoint when it becomes pretty obvious, and then we get more explanation of why they are being treated like this in the second half. But it also is very focused on these 3 main characters as people and their relationships with one another, and they all have very dislikable elements about them, but they all feel quite real and intriguing, and I really enjoyed reading about them. I'd maybe prefer to describe them as flawed characters actually than dislikable characters, because I think there's definitely a difference between somebody like the main character in The Dumb House, who is, you know, just straight up dislikable, whereas these characters are just very real, flawed characters with perhaps very irritating qualities if you met them in the real world, but also endearing qualities as well. And yeah, I really enjoyed reading about them, so I would highly recommend that one, but full review linked in the description box if you're interested. As you can tell, I had quite a good reading month this month. I read quite a lot, and the next 2 books I listened to an audiobook, and they were amazing, guys. They were rereads, and those were the first 2 stories in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes series, and those are 2 of the 4 novels. So it starts with A Study in Scarlet, which is the story that Dr. Watson and Sherlock Holmes meet in, and then the second novel is A Sign of 4, which is another mystery that they are involved in. And I listened to these in the new Stephen Fry release by Audible, which is Stephen Fry narrating almost the entire collection of Sherlock Holmes stories. I think it actually might be missing a few, which is a shame, but most of them. And this whole collection, guys, cost me 1 credit. 1 Audible credit, and you get, I think, something like 60 or 70 hours worth of Sherlock Holmes, and I can never reread Sherlock Holmes too much, and Stephen Fry is a phenomenal narrator, so I was so excited for this when I realised it was happening, and I was not let down. I loved listening to both of these novels, particularly A Study in Scarlet, because it'd been a lot longer since I'd reread that one, and oh, it just warms my heart. And I love these stories, and I'm really excited to keep going, and the next up is a collection of the short stories, so I'm really excited to listen to those on audiobook as well. I've never actually read or listened to all of Sherlock Holmes from the beginning in order. So I think that's going to be a really fun experience, and I'm enjoying it so far. The whole world of Sherlock Holmes though is a bit too complex for me to get into on this video though, so if you haven't read them yet, I have a whole video introducing you to Sherlock Holmes and the different stories within it, so I'll link that down below as well. Penultimately for this video, the next book I read was The Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander. This is the first in the Prydain Chronicles, and I was lent this by my lovely friend Elle, who told me that this is the book that the Black Cauldron Disney film is based on, and I love the Black Cauldron film. It's one of my favourite cartoon films, and I was so excited to read the book that it was inspired by. This is only part of the story, obviously a fuller version than is in the film, but I think the film is based on the first 3 books, so I'm definitely going to have to pick up the second one. But it is just real traditional children's fantasy, so if you like things like The Hobbit or The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, those are the kind of things it reminded me of. It's very fast paced, new antagonists are constantly popping up and disappearing again, and yeah, it's incredibly fast paced, but it is also really magical. And it follows our protagonist, who is an assistant pig keeper to an oracular pig, kind of like a psychic pig who tells the future, and the Horned King is after Henwen, this pig, so that he can, you know, use her powers to help him gain more power throughout the lands, and our main character then has to go off on an adventure to save the pig and picks up a few companions on the way. But yeah, that's that book. And then lastly, I do have the book I read last here with me because I finished it in Edinburgh, and that is Hag-Seed by Margaret Atwood. I really enjoyed this book, guys. I was not expecting to enjoy this book as much as I did, I must say. This book is a retelling of Shakespeare's play The Tempest from the Hogarth Shakespeare series. You do not have to have read The Tempest though to read this book. I have read The Tempest in high school, so, you know, 7-8 years ago I think I read it, and I had a vague memory of it, but I can't say it was that visceral in my mind, and I certainly hadn't remembered everything that they mention in this book. But like I said, you do not have to have remembered it. What's happening in this book is that our main character Felix is a director and an actor and a playwright, and he over the past few years has lost both his wife in childbirth and then 3 years later his daughter. And after this happens, his theatre group then give him the sack and he loses his job, and he is pretty furious, you know, his life's kind of spiralling out of control, so he moves to rural Canada and ends up with a job in a men's prison teaching a literacy course, which he decides to do through the art of plays, and he puts on performances of different Shakespeare's plays with the men in the prison. But over the years he is essentially biding his time until he can get his revenge on the men who got him fired, which is also one of the main themes in The Tempest. And he decides to put on a performance of The Tempest at the men's prison. So it's kind of about the parallels between The Tempest, his life, whether he has constructed those parallels or they were there anyway. It deals with grief, and there are elements of his grief that manifest themselves in his life when he's away from everybody else in his rural cottage, and you're never quite sure what's going on there and where this is going to lead. I just find this an incredibly intriguing plot. I found all the characters really interesting, and the more I read, the more I couldn't put it down, and I wanted to know what was going to happen. There was always another step that I felt like, oh, what next? There's still questions unanswered for me, and I really enjoyed it. It was quite unlike anything else I've read by Atwood though. Firstly because it's narrated by a male character, and none of the other books I've read by her have been solely narrated by a man. But also because it doesn't do the flashback thing, which she's done in a lot of her earlier works I've read. In fact, all of the other books I've read by her, apart from The Heart Goes Last, use the flashback technique as the narrative style, and this doesn't. This is linear from beginning to end, so that was quite different. And yeah, it was just very different from the other Margaret Atwood I've read, but really good in its own way, and I just love what she did with The Tempest. I think this was just a great book. Those are all of the books I read in the month of March, so no mean number I feel, so I hope you enjoyed this video and I managed to give you a bit of insight into each of the titles in it. But until next time guys, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye!